So, yes, I debated David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman, and I hate to say that because that's just got to be a pain no matter what the guy does. He's always the son of Milton Friedman, but just so people know who he is. And what we were actually supposed to debate two things at PorcFest. It was supposed to be the methodological issue between Austrian economics and Chicago School, and then the different foundation for anarcho-capitalism, meaning like a natural rights sort of perspective versus a utilitarian one. But there was a miscommunication, and so he thought we were just debating the methodology. So if people watch the video, I just want to clarify that's what happened. It was an honest misunderstanding in the beginning. And so as far as the methodological dispute, yes, I think it's important for people to realize, because a lot of people say, hey, why do you guys, are you so particular about Austrian economics and you want to do brand differentiation? Aren't you guys a free market school pretty much like the Chicago School? And so why do you need to go out of your way to distinguish yourselves? Why don't you just all fight the Keynesians, the common enemy? And the reason we stress these things is that there are important differences, and I think the guy who tweeted this, Tom, may be onto something, that perhaps these methodological disputes, which to some people seem like mere philosophy, actually have policy conclusion relevance. So as far as the methodological dispute, basically it's coming down to, how do you do economics? What does it mean to go do economics? What does it look like? And Milton Friedman had a famous exposition largely for it's readable by the layperson. I'm not sure what his target audience was. And he made this famous analogy saying to physics, saying we don't need realism if we want to come up with a model to explain, like if someone's playing pool, we can have a model for that and know the laws of physics and so on, and predict that the expert pool player is solving complex differential equations in his mind when he lines up the cue stick and knows how much force to apply and knows the mass of the cue ball. And it's possible that actually a pool hustler from Chicago doesn't even know who Isaac Newton is. It's not that he knows the laws of physics. It's just we can model that system as if he knows the laws of physics, because that gives us pretty good predictions. So that was his approach. And so he said, by the same token, it doesn't matter whether actual entrepreneurs in the market economy are hyper-rational and that they know all the things that in our economic models we assume they know, and that they can solve complex calculus problems to find the equilibrium outcome or the profit-maximizing point from our models. We can treat it as if they do, because those are good enough approximations. And then Friedman goes on to say, how do you know whether a simplifying but false assumption is acceptable? And he said, well, you look at the outcome. If the predictions, the falsifiable empirical predictions that your model shoots out, if you go check the data and it's close enough, and your model's good enough, and actually it's good if the assumptions are false, because in order to make reality tractable, you have to make simplifying assumptions. Okay, so that's the Friedmanite approach, and the Austrians, at least in the tradition of Ludwig von Mises, have a completely different approach, and they adopt what's called praxeology, saying you start from the action axiom, the idea that people act, that they engage in purposeful behavior, they have subjective goals, and they use their reason to adopt means to try to achieve them, and then you logically deduce step-by-step implications from that. And so the nature of that enterprise is not going to give you quantifiable predictions, like saying GDP next quarter is going to rise by 2 to 2.5 percentage points with 95% confidence. That's not the kind of thing that's going to pop out of that framework. But actually, Mises argues the stuff that does come out of that is far more useful, and that's what we really mean by economics. So to give a practical example of all this in the debate, and this can get real heavy, obviously, and so I motivated it by saying, look at David Friedman and the people here in the crowd, we all passionately believe in free trade, don't we? We are free traders. We think protectionism makes a country poorer. But how did you come to adopt that belief? It wasn't because you looked at statistical regressions before and after NAFTA was passed or something like that. No, you read Bastiat's Petition of the Candlemakers. You read clever little thought experiments that were written out in prose in 3 or 4 paragraphs, just having you logically imagine a scenario and seeing the inner logic of free trade. And so it was a mental, logical, deductive process. It was not an empirical verification of your tentative hypothesis. And so I was just trying to get them to see the core of what we all think of as economics is actually something you get using the method that Mises adopted or explained, and that the reason the Friedmanite approach seems so fashionable is that is clearly what they do in the natural sciences. And since we want to be good scientists like physicists, that's why a lot of economists think, oh, well, we got to do the same techniques. But actually, Mises pointed out that no, what is correct in the natural sciences does not work in the social sciences.
Okay, now let me put myself in the shoes of the person asking the question. Let's take the best-known example of a difference between the Austrians and the Chicago people. That would be monetary policy. How do you think this approach to doing economics yields you such divergent views on the subject of monetary policy? I mean, is there a connection?
I'm not sure if there is, and by that, that's not like my weasel way and polite way of saying he's wrong. I have not thought about it that carefully on that particular question. So just to make sure your listeners know what he's talking about, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz famously revised the professional economics mainstream opinion as to what made the Great Depression so long. That the standard Keynesian view had been that aggregate demand collapsed because of the stock market crash and bank failures and so on. The Federal Reserve and other central banks tried to inflate in the early 1930s, but they were pushing on a string. That was the famous metaphor, saying that once interest rates had fallen to rock bottom levels, the central banks were impotent, and that's why you needed the governments to come in and engage in deficit spending, right? So the analysis was quite similar to what somebody like Paul Krugman would say since 2008. And so it was Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in their Monetary History of the United States who came along decades later and said, no, actually, the Federal Reserve didn't do enough. That what happened is people were the public was taking their money out of commercial bank accounts because they wanted to hold the actual currency. And then if you understand how fractional reserve banking works, when the public takes money out of the banks, that actually shrinks the overall quantity of money as measured by M1, for example. And so Friedman was saying, yeah, the Fed did try to inflate, but they didn't do enough. They should have inflated a lot more on their end so that the money held by the general public ended up not falling, because by that measure, M1 did fall by like a third from 1929 to 33. Okay, so there you have a stark example of the difference in a policy recommendation between the Austrians and the Chicago School monetarists, that the Austrians say, yeah, if you want to understand what the Fed had to do with the Great Depression, it was that the Fed inflated too much in the 20s. That caused an unsustainable boom. A crash was inevitable. And then, of course, Hoover and FDR just added all sorts of bad things on top of it and made the adjustment to the new reality agonizingly long. Whereas Friedman was saying, no, the problem was the reason there was a stock market crash in 29 is the Fed, for some reason, chickened out and stopped pumping in money in the late 1920s. And that was the policy mistake. And then once the crash did happen, they also were very inadequate in inflating. So that's a clear-cut policy difference. And so if the question is the methodological dispute, does that have something to do with it? I think it does, at least in this respect. You can ex post, I mean, economic history, there are so many moving parts. Ex post, I can tell you any story you want and give you some facts to buttress it, all right? And that's why, Paul Krugman can look at the 30s, and I don't think he's consciously lying. I think he honestly is seeing the facts jump out at him that, oh my gosh, you idiots, look at how the gold standard tied all these governments' hands. Look at how they engaged in inadequate deficit spending. And it was only the advent of the wartime spending and removing the gold standard when everything went back to normal. So how can anyone but an ideologue who works for the Heritage Foundation not see that evidence screaming out at you? And so the point is, you can always pick and choose facts that buttress your case. And so, unfortunately, and part of it is because there's no controlled experiments in economics. So if two physicists are arguing over something that involves the charge on an electron, or, they can do a controlled experiment in the lab and perhaps see who's right and who's wrong, at least tentatively, but you can't do that with, we can say, oh, geez, the Obama stimulus package, they passed it, and then unemployment was worse with the deficit spending than they projected it would be if they did nothing, so we win, right? And they said, no, the economy was worse than we realized. The point is, they're not lying when they say that. They could be right in their own world, and so I think that's part of it, that Milton Friedman's approach, and that was part of Mises' critique of that whole enterprise, of trying to come up with falsifiable predictions and then go and check them against the data to see whether what you said is true or not. That's not a very good way to learn basic economic laws or principles the way you can uncover the laws of physical nature using that technique.
Well, are we saying then that everybody except the Austrians is at some level doing anti-theoretical economics? Is everybody just looking at empirical data and pulling out what they want to see from it? Or don't they have some theoretical apparatus, don't they?
They do, and this also, for those of you who want to go look at that, if you go to YouTube and say Bob Murphy, David Friedman, Pork Fest debate,
well, we'll put it in the show notes for this episode. This episode is September 30th, 2014. So when you look in the archives, that's where you'll find it. I'll link to it there.
Okay, yeah. So it's true that David Friedman was getting visibly irritated with me, thinking I was setting up a straw man, and he was saying, "No, we have theory too." And also by the same token, there are certain things. Like, let me give you an example. I think we can a priori logically deduce Austrian business cycle theory, and we can also deduce that raising the minimum wage causes unemployment so long as you raise the minimum wage legally above where the market clearing level would have been. Right? I think we can get those results without referring to empirical evidence. But then if you ask me, okay, why is the unemployment rate, why was it so high in 2010? To tease out the different implications and to say, well, was it because they raised the minimum wage, which they did do, or was it because of the lingering effects of the housing bubble? I mean, that's something where I do think you would need to go look at data. You couldn't just a priori know those sorts of things. So I think the two camps are actually closer in practice than they may think if you just listen to the methodological arguments. And by the same token, I think a lot of the Chicago school guys are very good economists. But again, it's where I think they really shine and their brilliance is in their a priori stuff. Like I even pointed out that one of the best arguments for free trade I've ever encountered, David Friedman invented. And he has it in his book Hidden Order, I think, and Steve Landsberg reproduces it. And so, just to give it to you quickly, he was saying there's two ways that we can make cars in the United States, two technology functions, two production functions. One way is to send steel and rubber and whatever to factories in Detroit. That's one way of making cars. Another way is farmers grow wheat, put it on a ship, send it across the ocean, and then 6 months later it comes back as Toyotas. And that's another way of physically producing cars. And so when you think about it like that, you can see the silliness of using tariffs to protect U.S. automakers. That really you're not helping foster U.S. job creation. You're just putting it in one sector versus another. You're helping Detroit auto workers at the expense of Iowa farmers if you put in a tariff on foreign cars. Okay, but my point was that's not an empirical thing. That's a logical thing. And once you grasp that, boom, now all of a sudden you see the logic of free trade. And so that didn't come from Bastiat. That particular argument came from David Friedman. So I think what happens in practice is a lot of these guys want to dress up what they do in practice and explain it or codify their technique to make it look like they're doing what they think the physicists do, because they know, physics is the ultimate science, and we want to be scientific like those guys because they're so smart and the public loves them, and we want to be like that. But in practice, I think they're not understanding what it is to do good economics.